recovery. And we just wish Hashem's brachas for the families that are waking up this morning, most of whom don't even know yet, as many of the bodies haven't even been identified, and of course for the hundreds of injured, for Hashem's speedy recovery. May the merit of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the great Tana, whose love for every Yid was so powerful, may the merit of his neshama be a schus for each and every one of them. The neshamas who have gone to Gan Eden to be in his holy chambers in the presence of Hashem, and for all those who need a speedy recovery to have that immediately.
Amen.
Good morning, Rivka. Good morning, Dennis.
Good morning, Rabbi. Good morning, everyone.
So we're going to begin now the halachas today. As I mentioned, today's halachas is, in one word, shiurim. What does a shiur mean? A shiur does not mean a rabbi's chat or sermon or lesson. A shiur means a measurement. There was a point in Jewish history when rabbis actually spoke for a measured amount of time and not forever. And that's where the name shiur came from, because you would come together for a measured amount of time to study Torah. But today we're going to learn about shiurim in a different context, the measurements of food. In other words, how much of it is liable for punishment. I should point out, as the Rambam is going to say, the prohibition to eat non-kosher food applies to any measurement of food. Okay, so if there's the tiniest drop, I'm not allowed to put it in my mouth. Okay, yes, we're going to learn about, for example, this isn't going to be in today's halacha, but everybody's familiar with the idea of food becoming nullified, so to speak, 1 in 60, right? So if the classic example of a drop of milk falling into the cholent, if it's more than 60 times the amount, it's nullified. That does not mean that you're allowed to drop a half a teaspoon of milk into a vat of cholent. Okay, it just means that if it happens, it's not prohibited. So the prohibition is on anything in any instance. It's not allowed to be done intentionally. By the way, if it's done intentionally, then even 1 in 60 won't help, number one. And when it comes to eating, the tiniest, most minuscule amount is prohibited to consume. The question is, if it's done either unintentionally or if it's done unintentionally, what responsibility does a person have? And if it's done intentionally, at which point would a person be liable for one of the forms of punishment that might apply to whatever the prohibition at hand was being discussed? And that's what we are going to learn today. Perek Aleph. The minimum measure for which one is liable for partaking of any of the forbidden boons of the Torah is the size of an average olive. Okay, now how much is an average olive? Not what you're going to pick up at Pick and Pay in a pack of kosher olives. It is an exact measurement. There is a machlekes between the Pischei Tshuva and the Tosfos over whether it's a third of an egg or a half an egg. And in contemporary halachic measurements, the two most widely followed opinions are that of Reb Chaim Na and the Chazon Ish. Okay, so it's either between the two of them. The smaller measurement would be either 17 grams or 24 grams, or according to the more stringent opinion of Tosfos, it would be either 25 grams or 36 grams. And when it comes to halacha, when it's a biblical prohibition, you follow the more strict opinion, that would be 17 grams, and if it's a rabbinic prohibition, you follow the more lenient, which would be 25 grams. Okay, this applies. So these shiurim is whether for lashes, for kares, or for death at the hand of heaven. In other words, there's no capital punishment min haTorah that Bezdin imposed on a person. We explain that anyone who's liable for kaddish or death at the hand of heaven for partaking of forbidden food should receive lashes. Based this measure, as all of the measurements, is a halacha Sinai, and it is forbidden by scriptural law to eat even the slightest amount of a forbidden substance, and nevertheless, one receives lashes only for an olive-sized portion. If one partakes of any amount less than this measure, so if you decide to eat a gram, so to speak, of shellfish, then the person is given stripes for rebellious conduct, in other words, rabbinical malchus. Gimel, the measure of the size of an olive that you mentioned doesn't include what is between one's teeth. What is between one's gums, however, is included when one swallows, for his palate benefited from an olive-size portion of food. In other words, there's no palate benefit to the teeth, but to the gums there is. Even if one ate half of an olive-sized portion, vomited it, and then it's the same portion that was the size of half the size of an olive that he vomited, he is liable for the liability is for the benefit one palate receives from a forbidden substance. So even if your body did not absorb it, in other words, it went in and out, it is still a prohibition. Dalit. Kazayas chaylev, an olive-sized portion of forbidden fat, or nevela of a kosher animal, pigul, or a carbon that was given for the wrong intentions, laser carbon that was left over, or the like that was left in the sun and was reduced in volume, one who eats it is not viable. Okay, so it follows what it was at the time that you ate it. If afterwards one left it in the rain and it expanded, one is liable for their kaddish. Okay, so if you have a piece of forbidden meat, it shrinks to less than the forbidden size and then it expands, it's still prohibited. If originally it was smaller than an olive-sized portion, then expanded to the size of an olive, it is forbidden to partake of it, but one is not liable for lashes for it. Hey, Tarbayanu, we already explained that all of the forbidden substances in the Torah are not combined with each other to reach the minimum measure of the size of an olive. Okay, so therefore, for example, if a person eats 2 grams of a non-kosher animal of ostrich meat, and 2 grams of non-kosher fish, and 2 grams of truma, right? These numbers won't accumulate, with the exception of the meat of a nevela and the meat of a treifa, and the prohibitions involving a nazir is explained in the appropriate places where that will combine. The 5 types of grain, their flour, and their dough made from them, all can be combined with each other to reach a minimum measure size of an olive with regard to the prohibition against chametz on Pesach. Okay, so different forms of chametz can all combine. But if a person eats, for example, 15 grams of chametz and 15 grams of meat and milk cooked together, that wouldn't be a problem. I mean, it wouldn't be a problem. That wouldn't be liable for punishment. The prohibition against partaking of chadash for the offering of the Omer, and the prohibitions involving the second tithe, and the trumas. Okay. Vav Yeroy Ram says it appears to me, this is his opinion, that all produce from which we are required to separate tumah and the tithes can be combined to reach the minimum measure, the size of an olive, with regard to the prohibition against tevel, because a single prohibition is involved. To what can the matter be compared? To the meat and corpse of an ox, the corpse of a sheep, and the corpse of a deer, which can be combined to reach the minimum measure of the size of an olive, as we explained. Okay, so within one prohibition, you can have various sources of substance coming together to constitute the minimum threshold of a prohibited size. Zion, when a person partakes of a large amount of food from a forbidden substance, he is not liable for lashes or kaddish for every olive-sized portion he eats. Instead, he is liable once for all he ate. If, however, the witnesses gave him a warning for every olive-sized portion, he is liable for every warning, even though he ate it in one sitting without interruption. Okay. The following rules apply when a person partakes of a barley corn or mustard seed size portion of any forbidden food, waits, and then it partakes of another mustard seed size portion, whether inadvertently or intentionally. In other words, what the Rambam is referring to here, mustard seeds and barley corn seeds are much smaller measurements than a kazayas. And here he's saying that if he waited, so let's say I take 2 grams plus 2 grams plus 2 grams. When do I reach the threshold of 17? What if it's through a whole day, 2 grams every hour? Will I be liable for lashes? So if you waited from the beginning to the end, okay, from when he started eating the prohibited food till he finishing the amount of the minimum threshold of a prohibited measurement, okay, if he waited the time that it takes a portion of bread with relish, the size of 3 eggs or less, everything he ate is combined. And as he points out here, that in the commentaries, he explains the amount of time. What's the idea here? That kedei achilas pras is the minimum amount of time that it would take to finish, and he gives here between 4 minutes until 9 minutes is a different opinions for how long this has to be. So you have to consume this amount of food within that time period. He is liable for kares, lashes, or a sacrifice as if he ate an olive-sized portion at one time. If he waits a longer time over them getting to the end, the small portions are not combined. Since he completed the olive-sized portion only in a time longer than kedei achilas pras, he is not liable, even if he did not wait at all, but continued eating mustard-sized portion after mustard-sized portion. Okay, so he take 1 gram and then another gram. He didn't stop. Okay, so there's this chain smoke effect, but ultimately it takes more than that amount of time to finish. If not, it doesn't apply. Similar laws apply when a person drinks a nevius of ordinary gentle wine little by little, swallows liquefied leaven on Pesach, or fat little by little, or drinks blood little by little, and all of this. What is the amount? If he waits from the beginning till the end, the time it takes to drink nevius, all of the sipping is combined. If not, it is not combined. Okay, so in order to transgress on that, you need to finish it in that time. One is not liable for partaking of any of the prohibited foods unless one partakes of them in a manner in which one derives satisfaction, with the exception of a mixture of meat and milk and mixed species grown in a vineyard. The rationale is that with regard to these prohibitions, the Torah does not use the term eating, but instead conveys the prohibition against partaking of them in other terms. Okay? In other words, with regard to meat and milk, it uses the term cooking, and with regard to mixed species or vineyard, it uses the terms become halal and supplies they are forbidden even when it doesn't derive satisfaction. But everything else the Torah prohibits eating, and eating implies benefit and satisfaction. What is implied? When one liquefied fat and swallowed it when it was so hot that his throat was burned from it, or if he eats raw fat, which nobody likes, or mixed bitter substances like gal or wormwood into wine or into a pot when mitzvah nevel was cooking and makes it so disgusting he partook of it while they were bitter, or he ate a forbidden food after it became decayed, spoiled, and unfit for human consumption, he is not liable. Okay, so there are people who will check if their shampoo is kosher for Pesach in case it uses a flour base. I personally don't check my shampoo because if I would eat my shampoo, I would vomit it. Okay, if by contrast he mixed bitter substance into a pot where meat and milk are cooking, or into wine from a vineyard or mixed species are going to partook of it, he is liable. So by the way, just in terms of halacha yud aleph, where it comes into practical halacha, into practical relevance, even for those of us who generally don't go to the farms to buy prohibited fats and then eat it while it's burning, but where it does have relevance is when someone needs to take medication, for example, in a forbidden way. So let's say it's a medication that the person's life depends on it, their health depends on it, right? So it's permitted to take, but the person just doesn't feel comfortable. Rabbi, I don't need chametz on Pesach. I don't care if I'm allowed to. This medicine is chametz, and how do we avoid or minimize the prohibition? If you wrap it up in a tissue, so your mouth never touches it, never tastes it, and you pop it into your mouth. It's one of the ways of minimizing it. When a person partakes of one of the forbidden foods in a frivolous manner, or one who's acting purposely, he is liable, even though he did not intend to actually partake of the food. Since he derives pleasure, it's considered as if he intended to actually partake of the food. When by conscience the person is first to derive forbidden for pleasure, if he focuses his intent on it, he is liable. If he does not, it is permitted. Okay, Yud Gimel. When a person partakes of forbidden food because of desire or because of hunger, he is liable. If he was wandering in the desert and he has nothing to eat but a forbidden substance, it is permitted then because of danger to his life. Yudalit, when a pregnant woman smells of forbidden food and is overcome by a deep desire for it, and that is a well-known side effect of pregnancy, not from my own personal experience. I never was pregnant, but from those who have been, I have come to understand that you can develop a deep, deep craving for certain foods. Smells of forbidden food, she wants it. Consecrated meat or ham. She should be given some of the gravy. In other words, it gives her some of the taste and smell without the actual meat. Obviously, gravy of forbidden food is 100% non-kosher. You're not allowed to have it. But the level of transgression is somewhat less. So therefore, we try to minimize it. If not, if her mind becomes settled, that is commendable. If not, we feed her less than the forbidden measure, the meat itself. And if her mind does not become settled, we feed her until her mind becomes settled. Similarly, when a person smells food that contains vinegar or the like, in other words, substances that arouse the soul's desire, he's governed by the same laws that apply to a pregnant woman. In other words, there are times that the food itself has this powerful smell, and in those instances, it's allowed to be given to a person. When a person is overcome by severe hunger, he may be fed forbidden food immediately until his eyesight clears. We do not seek permitted food. Instead, we hurry to feed him what is available. We say here, severe hunger, we are referring to a clinical condition. It does not just mean I'm in a hungry mood and I pass by a McDonald's, chas v'shalom. We feed him substances bound by our lenient prohibitions first, and if a sight clears, that is sufficient. If not, we feed him the substances bound by the more severe prohibitions. And as you can see from what the Rambam is writing, you're talking here that it's to the extent that a person is feeling that his eyesight, is compromised by the level of hunger that he's going through. What is implied? If there's tevel and an avela, we feed him the avela first. The rationale is the partaking of tevel is punishable by death at the hand of heaven. Okay. Now, who would have thought? By the way, it's just interesting to learn the laws of Rambam. Who would have thought that non-kosher meat, in other words, beef at Woolworths, is less severe than beef from Woolworths is less severe than oranges from Woolworths. But that's possible because, as you see here, tevel, which is food produce that truma was not separated from, is a punishable by death at the hand of heaven, whereas the beef in the meat aisle of Woolworths is again. By the way, just to point out, obviously, sorry, I'm talking there about oranges from Israel, where the truma and the meiser wasn't taken off from them. Whereas non-kosher meat is obviously absolutely forbidden and a terrible sin to consume of it, but is not as severe as tevel. If the choice is between an avela and produce that grows on its own during Shemitah, we then feed in the produce because it's forbidden only by rabbinic decree, as will be explained in Hilchos Shemitah. If the choice is between tevel and produce grown during the sabbatical year, we feed in the produce grown during the sabbatical year. If the choice is between tevel and truma, if it's impossible to make the tevel acceptable, we feed him the tevel. The rationale is that it is not as sanctified as the truma is, and similar laws apply in all analogous situations. Yes. We have already explained that one prohibition does not take effect when another prohibition is already in effect, unless both of the prohibitions take effect at the same time. The latter prohibition forbids additional entities, or the latter prohibition encompasses other entities. This we already explained earlier the layers of prohibition that can be added onto an item of food. Accordingly, it is possible for that person to be a person who eats one olive-sized portion of food, and yet he will be liable for 5 sets of lashes for it. So not a very worthwhile exercise, provided he was warned for all 5 prohibitions that accumulated at once. So a person takes 1 spoonful of food, boom, gets 5 sets of lashes. Okay, so 195 lashes just for that. What is implied? For example, a person on Yom Kippur, okay, so it's 1 level of prohibition, who is ritually impure, okay, which means he's not allowed to eat from holy foods, who ate an olive-sized portion of forbidden fat from a consecrated animal that remained after its prescribed time, he is liable for lashes because he partook of forbidden fat, noiser, which means leftover, because he ate in Yom Kippur, because he partook of consecrated food while ritually impure, and because he derived benefit from consecrated food, thus violating the prohibition of Me'ilah. Finally, the Rambam concludes in the last halacha, why do these prohibitions fall in each other? Because although it was forbidden to partake of the fat of this animal, it was permitted to benefit from it. Okay, so the layers came one after another. Once he consecrated it, it became forbidden to benefit from the fat. Since the prohibition to benefit from it was added to it, so the prohibition against benefiting from consecrated carbohydrates become added. Although this fat was forbidden to an ordinary person, it was still permitted to be offered to the one on high. Okay, so it was permitted for the carbon. When it became nicer, so since it became forbidden to the mizbeach, right, it wasn't holy anymore, that prohibition was added for an ordinary person. This person was permitted to take the meat of the animal, although he was forbidden to partake of its fat. When it became impure, since the meat became forbidden, an additional prohibition was added to its fat. And once Yom Kippur started, all food became included in the prohibition. And since the prohibition affects non-consecrated food, it adds a prohibition to this fat. And similar laws applies in all analogous situations. So now we're going to do a little quiz on the laws of forbidden foods. I'm going to ask you to find a similar example where one item of food can have 5 layers of prohibition added on one after the other. But no, I won't. Don't worry. Any questions?
Rabbi, I have a comment, not a question.
Sure.
I've mentioned this before in one of our other classes. When my father was young, he contracted some kind of a very severe skin infection on his face. And he was in the hospital having radium treatment. In those days, they didn't have any of the modern stuff that we have now, although it's similar, radiotherapy. And there was a certain ingredient of fat that occurred only in, it was either bacon or ham, I'm not sure, but one of the, from a chazar, and the doctor prescribed that he had to have that because that fat was not obtainable in any other animal, and he had to eat it.
Wow. Interesting. And he was obviously allowed to.
Yes, yes. Well, I don't know whether at the time, whether he consulted a rabbi or anything like that, but That was that's what happened, because it was a matter of
interesting. I never actually heard of an example of chazer meat. The Rambam actually mentions it. He uses chazer, so now I understand why. I never heard of an example where chazer meat has the unique constitution of a.
Yeah, it was actually a therapeutic effect. It wasn't because he was hungry or anything. He had other food, but he had to include the chazer meat for that particular kind of fat, because it wasn't in any other meat.
Sure.
Thank you for sharing. Thank you for sharing.
Rabbi, I also read on the Chabad website is that it came about when I was looking at the vaccine and how safe it is and if that needs to be kosher and that kind of thing, and also read, like, for example, diabetics, because they inject themselves even though it has non-kosher ingredients in it, it's still
in
allowed.
An injection.
Yeah. And if a person's in hospital and they have to feed them through a tube through their nose, then even though it goes to the stomach, apparently that's also fine, because to save his life, kind of thing, I guess. Well, that's what I read, but don't quote me.
Interesting. Thank you. Thank you for sharing.
Rabbi, if I can have another go, there's also the instance of having medicines that are in capsules. Now, there's always the question.
Gelatin. The gelatin is often from a non-kosher animal.
Now, you do get some capsules that are made from kelp, from the sea, from seaweed. And those are okay. But it's also been said, and I saw this as a rabbinic pronouncement many, many years ago, that by the time that gelatin that's used to make the capsules, by the time it's processed, it goes through so many chemical processes, etc., that by the time it's formed into a capsule, there's actually no trace of gelatin in it.
Interesting. Okay. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.